Thank you for attending the class on Waterwise Gardening today, presented by UC Master Gardeners of El Dorado County. The Master Gardener mission is to extend research-based knowledge and information on home horticulture, pest management, sustainable landscape practices to our community. During this time of staying indoors, we can't offer our regular in-person classes, and therefore we're teaching virtually. Tonight's class is part one in a two-part series. Our class is being presented by UC Master Gardener Kit Veerkamp, and your host today is Mary Campbell and Tracy Celio. We'll get started in just a couple minutes. While we're waiting to get started, we have a poll that we'd like to post to get to know you a little bit. We'd appreciate you completing the poll, and then we'll share the results with you. While you're taking the poll, I have a couple housekeeping items to communicate with you. The presentation will be about 1 hour in length. We have about half an hour for questions. We appreciate and encourage your questions and will do our best to address them all at the end of the presentation. Since we have quite a number of participants, I've muted everyone except for our presenters. If you have questions, please type them into the chat and we'll collect them and go through them at the end, and we'll try to get to everyone. Shorten this presentation from an original 3 hours to make it more comfortable in this virtual environment. For that reason, we'll do part one this week, tonight, and we'll do part two next Wednesday, same time, 6:30, July 22nd. Same login and same registration that you have. We may not get to every topic, but we'll do our best. The information presented here will be available on the UC Master Gardeners of El Dorado website as early as tomorrow. You can simply Google UC Master Gardeners of El Dorado County and you can find us online. I will also post it in the chat window. Okay, so did you complete the poll? It looks like about 38 of 48 have completed it, so we'll go ahead and share these results. Okay, it looks like many of us are master gardeners, but more of us tonight aren't. So 59% are not master gardeners. 49% of us have not attended or have attended a class in the past. About 28% have attended a virtual class, and 23% this is your first class. Great, we're glad you're all here. Thinking about your irrigation water, where does it come from? Are you on a well or are you on metered water or municipal? 23% are on a well, like I am, and it looks like 77% are on metered water. So that'll help Kit when she's thinking about sharing Waterwise gardening with you tonight. So I'm gonna stop share. And the last thing I'd like to do is to welcome Kit Veerkamp. She is going to teach the class tonight. Go ahead and post questions in chat. And I will be recording this presentation tonight, and it will also be posted on our website. That said, thank you, Kit, and I'll let you take over.
Great. Thank you all for joining us. This is a first time doing this for me, and I think they've done a couple of these classes and they've worked out really well. It's wonderful to have people joining us from wide and far, far beyond El Dorado County. So anyway, welcome. And just a little background on me. I've been a master gardener since 2010, and that is following a 30-year career at that point in time as a landscape architect and a permaculture designer. I've been a certified arborist, and I have numerous other qualifications in irrigation, etc. So anyway, and green gardener. I just love this topic. I love gardening and extending this information to those of you who enjoy it as well. So with that, I'm going to, let's see, get the poll out of my way. And so we're going to be, actually, the title of the class is Water Resilient Landscapes. That's something we decided late to change it to, but this will be part one. And our agenda, I'm going to do a slight overview talking about the California water story, because it's sort of why we're here and having to talk about water resilient gardening. We're going to focus first on the soil, because it all starts with the soil. All of our gardens do, and even water resiliency is heavily determined by the quality and health and tilth of your soil. And that will pretty much, it will talk a little bit about hydrozoning and plant selection. I will finish that plant selection up next week, along with going into the ins and outs of irrigation and scheduling, and then also talking a bit about capturing and utilizing rainwater. If that's something that we can do to help not rely so much on our wells and our metered water. And we will have a Q&A at the end of this class and at the end of the next class as well. So here we go. And I've got a list of resources. Again, as Tracy mentioned, you will be able to access this presentation later from the website. So there are a list of resources here that you can access. And later, if you want to find out more about particular topics related to this presentation. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about the California water story. As most of you are well aware, because it's always in the news, is that climate change is having a tremendous effect on the Sierra Nevada. And that's where we are in El Dorado County. If you're from somewhere else and not close by, you know, we're up out of northeast of Sacramento. And also that our aquifers and reservoirs are being drawn down now on a regular basis. The Sacramento Valley area aquifers are being drawn down way below historical capacities, and throughout the valley, the greater valley. And then the contamination of the aquifers and our water sources, period. So saving on water helps with all of those issues, or these are issues affecting the topic. Going back to April 2015, we were required to cut back roughly 25% given the status of the drought at that point in time. We had been short for years. We're looking at this. This is a snapshot of what the state's water looked like in the year 2000 going up to 2015. Now, our last 2 years prior to this, we had some really great years and great rainfalls. But as of this year, we're starting to look at drought all over again. We had a very substandard rainfall in our area this year. I believe most of the state did. So again, even though it makes people feel all good and happy to get those years with great rainfall, it's like we're back to conserving. And the laws that are coming down through the state are going to mandate even more water conservation measures as we go along. Those will be starting to be implemented in the next couple of years. So where does our water come from? Most of it comes from the Sierras, the snow melt from the Sierra Nevadas, and flowing into the Sacramento-San Joaquin Delta. 60% of the treated water in California comes from the Sierra Nevada, and 30% of the groundwater from the aquifers. And so as water diminishes coming out of the Sierra Nevada, it taxes that resource and our ability to do gardening and a lot of other things the way we're used to doing them. So climate change is enhancing or speeding up glacial retreat. Our snowpack is decreasing every year. This year it was just abominable. The snow level is rising in terms of where it may have used to regularly snow down to 2,000, 2,500 feet. We're rarely seeing that anymore. The average snow level is even above the Tahoe Basin at this point in time. There's a decline in runoff, and the peak runoff timing, we'll talk about that later, about how that really affects the ability to store it, and then off storage capacity. Our glaciers are getting down to where they're just a pittance in California. We used to have some fairly good sized glaciers up in the Sierra, and those are diminishing with each year. The drought has taken them down. A glacier is something that actually, a body of ice that moves, but we have lost 55% of those sources between 1900 and 2004 now. So that's another diminishing resource, water resource. This is just kind of a glimpse of what that looks like. You can see back just past the turn of the century, the 1900s, versus what some of these glaciers are looking like now. And then we've got issues with how is water stored. On surface-wise, we've got our lakes, and then we've got our reservoirs. And thank goodness for the reservoirs we do have, or we would really be, we probably wouldn't be gardening at all. And then subsurface, which is what we rely on for much of our water. Fissures and cracks in the rock up in the Sierra is where our wells get drilled and how we get water out of those. It's not an aquifer like a lot of people think. If you look in the lower left-hand corner, that's what an aquifer looks like in the valley. Very different mechanisms for underground water storage. So our snowpack's decreasing. Normally it provides 1/3 of the state's water supply, but it's diminishing all the time. And since 1915, by the amount equivalent to Lake Mead, that's a lot of loss in snowpack in terms of the runoff that we would normally see. And we're just seeing that all through the Pacific states. It's not just unique to California. And again, talking again about the rise in the snow level and decline in runoff due to the lack of snow or diminished capacity. So our water and how we deal with it is changing. Our peak runoff time, normally all that snow melt is running off in the spring and summer, and that's when the majority of it runs off into the reservoirs and creeks and streams. But what's happening because of climate change is that runoff is occurring earlier. So we get this difficult strategy. Usually the strategy is everything's running off in May, April, May, and they're capturing it and storing it. And yeah, occasionally you get the big rain and they have to release water out of the reservoirs, but that's water, when they release it, can't be gotten back, and it's not stored for summer use. So early runoff is resulting in early releases, resulting in less water stored, resulting in longer summer droughts. And that has consequences for not only our water supply, but our ecosystem in terms of water required for fisheries and then wildfire management as well. So normally, and this is Folsom Lake, normally you look at the picture on the left, that's a normal, you know, when we've had decent rain years, and it looks like that now. Whereas in 2014, it was a pretty sad story in terms of really getting down to almost nothing in mud puddles. So there aren't many other storage projects coming on. It's one of those things where it's diminishing returns at this point. It costs so much, and there are not a lot of sites left to be able to build these types of reservoirs. And so therefore, we try to utilize the ones we have to the best of the state's ability in terms of water management. And again, this just shows you kind of, again, in the mountain regions, how water and groundwater recharge occurs. You've got these fissures if you're lucky, and you've got a good well driller. He finds those fissures, taps into it, and voila, you've got your well. Other times they can go to 900, 1,500 feet and still find diddly squat. And you may have to try again or just not rely on that resource. In the valley, you've got the aquifer systems, which are fed also by mountain runoff from the rivers and overflows, and the valley being just saturated. The whole Sacramento Valley used to be essentially a bathtub all winter long. So there was always opportunity to recharge those aquifers. But now the demands between population and farming, they're sucking that resource dry. There's actually the subsidence in the valley is measurable and significant. And the depletion of the aquifers, they're not underground lakes like I know at some point that was something that I had a vision, or that's what I envisioned an aquifer look like. It's actually water is being stored between sand and gravel and silt, and it's just a very saturated layer and layers of water in the soil. So talking about water conservation, we're looking at a holistic approach of creating, number one, drought-resistant soils. We're going to be talking next week about using efficient irrigation and installing systems to capture and reuse water. And in this state, we are permitted to capture stormwater and gray water, and that helps to recycle and use it to the best of our ability. Not everybody has, you know, the kinds of storage systems, but I'll be talking about some of those that you can actually build into your landscape that will help you maximize the capture of water and sinking of water to keep it on your property. Water conservation also involves the selection of correct plants, of drought-tolerant plants, native plants that help, that reduce the need for water, that thrive with lack of water. And talking about grouping by plants by water needs, this is something that's being talked about a lot more in the realm of water conservation. It's something that we never used to think about. This sort of, you just kind of planted by sun or shade and that was it. We weren't really focused on so much drought tolerant. We might have a plant here or there, but not really thinking about how those plants all go together. And then we'll be talking about minimizing or eliminating lawn. That is one of the largest water users in most people's homes or at their homes. And so reducing or eliminating it really does help to not only conserve water, but reduce the need for fertilizers and pesticides that most people feel compelled to use on their lawns. And I'll talk about alternatives to those. So as I mentioned, it starts with the soil, whether we're talking about landscaping in general or water conservation. This is where it starts to maximize and your water resiliency. So the topsoil formation occurs as materials and bedrock and all that break down, and waste material in terms of leaves and detritus and everything else breaks down and contributes. It decays, it composts, and it starts mixing with the minerals on the surface, and then we get soils. And as the cycle is continuous. Soils are a complex mixture of minerals, air and water, and hopefully organic matter. That's one of the things that in many of the areas, I know here in the foothills, we're shy on. We're usually looking at somewhere in the order of 2% organic matter if we're lucky. And we'll talk a little bit about your own management of fallen leaves, etc. Because removing the leaves from your garden contributes to the lack or shortage of organic matter in your soil. So we'll be talking more about that. Air and water is very, very important. I'm gonna go back here real quick. So air and water should be roughly 50% of the soil itself. When it gets compacted or it gets oversaturated, then it makes it tough for roots to grow. Air and water is in those voids between the soil, mineral, and organic particles, but it moves through the soil two ways. One is it just soaks on through, that's called gravitational water. And the other is by capillary action, where it can move up and down and sideways by just simple electronic or electrical pull with the molecules. And what ends up happening is as water moves through the soil, it pushes stale air out and it pulls in air from the surface, displacing carbon dioxide. So it keeps the soil aired well, so that when you don't have fresh air moving into the soil, you get anaerobic conditions that can kill roots and kill plants. So you want soil that is not compacted nor oversaturated. So again, water movement is what pushes and pulls the air mixture in the soil. If your soil's compacted, it reduces that pore space. And so that you get anaerobic activity, which is not good. It sets the stage for disease and pests. And then again, if it gets too compacted or too saturated, what ends up happening is the byproduct of anaerobic activity produces alcohol that also kills plant roots. And then there's always this little layer, microscopic layer of water on all molecules of soil molecules and minerals, but it can't be used by the roots. However, it is used by soil microbes, and we'll be talking a little more about that. They can still move around, and that's a good thing. So there's two aspects to soil. There's soil structure and soil texture. And what's involved in that is we need to look at particle size. So you've heard people talk about having sand, silt, or clays, or loam type soils. Well, when you look at the relative sizes of the particles that make up soil, you can see how large a particle of gravel can be. This is just, this is all really relative. Sand particles are probably a third that size, silt's down to a pinpoint, and clay is totally invisible, can only be seen with a microscope. So that's how small they are in comparison. We'll talk more about the relevance of this when it comes to scheduling, irrigation scheduling, because you have to know what kind of soils you have in order to schedule your irrigation properly. So that was texture. Soil structure is the arrangement of those particles. So, we can have very kind of loose single grain soils. You can have things that are very cloddy or in platy, and then granular. The granular would be sort of like, all of a sudden it's going to decomposed granite. My soils are relative, after they get past blocky and I break them up, they're more granular. That's before I amended them. So anyway, all of this, the soil structure and how the particles all fit together definitely affects your drainage and water movement and air circulation.
Leave it and I'll throw it. Leave it.
So, like I mentioned, you need to have some idea of what your soil is, where you are, and where you're gardening, because it will affect how you apply water, how quickly, and how frequently. If you want to be saving water, knowing this information and then working with it will allow you to greatly reduce your water usage and use it to the best, for the best health of your plants.
Leave it.
It's not my dog. So talking about a soils analysis, we're going to talk about a do-it-yourself method and then another way to kind of look at what's in your soil. So a soil analysis looks at the amount of nutrients available in the soil. That's generally for agricultural purposes, but the chemical, physical, and biological properties of your soil. It looks at the macro and micronutrients, your pH, and that's going to be important. We'll talk more about how pH influences nutrient uptake. It analyzes the percentage of organic matter. Many of these also analyze and determine if there's a lot of salts in your soil, because that can affect your water usage and plant health, and then your soil structure. So I'm going to very quickly, go through how to do a jar test. This is something you can do at home rather than having to pay for a soils analysis. And it might give you, depending on your soils, can be very helpful. So I'm not going to go through this step by step. It's got a list of materials here. And the one thing, it essentially involves putting a soil sample in a jar along with something to help those particles pull apart, either Calgon or dish detergent. And then in that whole process, what you want to do first is make sure you get a number of soil samples. And there's, again, a whole list of things here in terms of getting down deep enough so that you can take out a strip of soil. You're going to mix a couple of different soil. You don't want to do it in just one place, because you might be picking a place that is not necessarily representative of what you actually have. So you want to take a few samples here and there all over the yard, mix them together, and then work with that mixture to do your soils test. So you end up putting the soil in a jar, shaking it with either Calgon or Dawn dish detergent, letting it sit, and then measuring it at various stages. And from there, now so we talk about doing it that way. You can also stick it in a blender if you've got an old blender you don't care about. That can make it really great, because it really does break it up even more so that the clay particles get separated from the other types of minerals. But so when you do that jar test and you've taken those measurements that we talk about here, you'll let it sit for 40 seconds, you'll measure, you'll let it sit for another 30 minutes and measure. And then after that, you'll let it sit for a couple of days, and you'll get you'll get 3 different measurements. So with those, you end up using those to determine what percentage of sand, silt, and clay you have in your soils. And from there, we're going to take, and then you can plot it out onto the soil triangle. And as you can see on the left-hand side, this is just a hypothetical where you've determined you've got this 39% sand, 43% silt, 17.5% clay in your this one sample. And from there, then you extrapolate onto the soil triangle, and you will find in this particular case, you have a loam. Now, that's an ideal soil. Probably almost none of us will have that. I happen to, but I don't know how I got lucky with that one. I actually have silty loams. The easier way to do this is to use the Soil Web app. This is an app that's available for all smartphones. It is a USDA NCS. It's based on USDA data, and it contains way more information about soils than you would ever hope to learn. But all you're looking for, in this particular case, this is my home. I've got it zeroed in, and you can see here it's got SUD in the area. Part of my property has AXD, but I don't care about that because I'm not doing any landscaping there. So it gives me, on the left-hand side, you see where my soils are made up of Sobrante, Auburn, and Boomer. And when you select yours, you'll come up with a chart, similar chart as well. And going in and clicking on those, it tells me that I've got the Boomer series is a fine loam. The Auburn series is a loam, a mixed loam. And the other one, which I can't read under the tag, the Auburn is a silt loam. So that tells me I've got fine silty loams. That may be far easier than trying to do a jar test, but the jar test is kind of fun to do. I did do one. And this has been sitting now for a year outside, because when I did it, it was absolutely unreadable because I have a fine silt. It's such fine silt, it never got those layers like most tests will. But I still wanted to kind of show. And then the really, really fine clay layer there on the top, that took 4 months to fall out like that. So, I mean, that just, the rest of that, what you're seeing, the granular stuff you're seeing in there is just simply trapped air bubbles. So it's not sand particles or anything else. So I have, and this corresponded with the USDA soil web app. That made all the sense in the world. So once you know what your soil is, you also want to do a drainage test. It's one of the things that, and you probably know whether or not your soils drain or not. You'll have some idea, especially if you have standing water. But digging a hole 12 inches deep, 6 inches wide, filling it and watching how long it takes to go down and measuring that will tell you a lot about how fast things do drain. Now, if you're in the Sacramento Valley, you may also have conditions where you've got hard pan in your soil. We don't have hard pan so much in the foothills, although if you have clay layers, it can act as a hard pan. But a hard pan in the valley is a different thing, and it really can hold water and make things very difficult to manage irrigation, and let alone during winters when you've got standing water in your yard. When you do a soils test, typically they'll come back with an analysis of your nutrients in your soils. But the trouble with that is they're measuring what's in the soil, but it doesn't necessarily measure plant available nutrients. Chemical reagents in a lab don't emulate plant roots and how they take it up. So, and your soil chemistry changes throughout the year depending on temperature and the kinds of roots and all kinds of interactions going on in the soil. And plus, these procedures vary widely from lab to lab. There are labs who will test for soil microbes, soil life, and that can be often a little more helpful. But your actual percentage of organic matter will be a good indicator probably of how much soil life and activity you have. Higher numbers in the 5%, 6% range is really good. As I mentioned in the foothills here, we're lucky to have 2% soil, 2% organic matter in our soils, unless you're in a very wooded part. You have oak woodland around where constant leaf drop and that's been decaying and it's just nobody's ever cleaned it up. That's usually great lofty stuff there. So just goes back to your soil structure and the arrangement of particles again, just kind of reiterating how that's different. But your soil structure, good soil structure is granular and crumbly, and it really resists erosion, whereas poor soil structure, when it's really compacted or it's hard as a rock, it makes it more difficult to hold water. There's very little air for roots or organisms. I know we've got parts of our property where vehicles had been driving for a long time, where we used to have a circular driveway that is no longer, and it's hard to get that uncompacted once it is compacted. And therefore, it's more difficult to grow plants. Typically, when you have poor soil structure, what ends up happening is you overwater or over-fertilizing. You're over-fertilizing, trying to make up for the fact that the soil cannot handle the roots growing in it. So tilth, we talk about tilth. I'm sure most of you have heard tilthy soils, and that's something that we all should look to attain if we can. That tilthiness is got enough looseness in it that roots easily move through and penetrate and access all the nutrients and minerals, etc., that they need, as well as all the soil organisms. You can see on the left-hand side that's more compacted soil, although it looks like I do see a worm in there. But you can see how much richer brown and a lot more root mass in the one on the right-hand side. So that's a more favorable root environment. Soil pH is one of those things that, and don't go out and get those soil pH meters. They're really not very effective. But most of us have pHs that are relatively normal. If you don't, and you have a problematic soil, you're seeing lots of yellow leaves, there could be things going on there, but soil pH affects the ability for certain nutrients to be taken up by plants. You can see where there's this happy place between 6 and 7.5 in there, slight alkaline to slightly acidic, where you can see most of the nutrients are able to be taken up. You get too acidic or too basic, the nutrients get locked up by other molecules, and so then the plants can't access them. And we'll talk about with the soil food web how that moderates soil pH to make things better for minerals and other elements to be taken up by plants. So it's not something to worry too much about unless you know you've got soils that are too acidic or too basic. In that case, now you know why you're having issues with your plants. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the soil food web, which this stuff just gives me goosebumps. It's fun because I had no idea. I mean, I've been in the landscape industry since college, and it's just something, learning about the soil food web is something that is relatively new over the last 10 years and getting more widely talked about. Through the process of photosynthesis, plants convert sun energy to chemical energy in the form of carbohydrates or sugars. And also, and carbon is a part of that process. Sugars are carbon, or made up largely of carbon. We talk about exudates, that plants, how they move sugars through their systems, starting with photosynthesis, sugars being created in the leaves, move down the stems, out the roots, and they're either stored in the roots or plants exchange sugars with organisms and trade those for other elements that they need, or other nutrients. And a plant gets roughly 85 to 90% of their nutrient needs met by this exchange that goes on with soil organisms. So the soil food web primarily consists of microorganisms in the soil that you cannot see. They are tiny and microscopic. It's kind of fun to see pictures of these and work with a microscope and see them. But essentially what happens is that, again, the plants are sending these sugars down into their roots, and bacterias and nematodes and fungi are feeding on these sugars. They're exchanging them for other nutrients with the plants. Other larger organisms like nematodes, arthropods, and protozoa are feeding on the bacteria. There's a little war going on between fungi and nematodes. You've got each controlling the others, and onward it goes. And then we've got our mammals that are reliant, very reliant on that whole system as a food web. Most birds' diets consist of in large part of the insects and that are also feeding in the soil and the microorganisms in the soil. So there's just this whole food web that's dependent on plants. And this one, you can see this is macroorganisms, but again, there's a whole world of organisms out there in your garden, and these are not bad. These are really critical to keeping a balanced ecosystem in your garden. Yeah, some of these are not good necessarily, but the fact that you have, once things are in balance, the good organisms keep the bad organisms in control. 1 teaspoon of healthy soil can contain 1 million to 1 billion bacteria, miles of fungal hyphae. You can see the numbers, you know, protozoas, nematodes, thousands of microarthropods, and it's more organisms in a teaspoon of soil than people who've ever lived on this planet. It's really quite amazing to think about. So soil is not just dirt. When people refer to it as dirt, no, soil is a life, and it's very important. And the reason they're so important is because they are part of what we call the poop loop. As bacteria feed on other bacteria and other organisms feed on bacteria, everything always has an intake and an excrement cycle. That is taken up by something else, ingested, things die and are ingested. It's just a constant cycle of organic matter going on in the soil, and everything's relying and reorganizing some aspect of something else in the soil. And in that, what happens when they do that is you've got nitrogen released and other nutrients released that can then be taken up and exchanged with plant roots and provided in what they call plant available form to the plants. And that's why these organisms are so important. So fungi, I know, again, so a lot of you are hearing, if you've been gardening for very long, you're hearing the term fungi and mycorrhizae a lot. The fungi includes a whole list of various organisms, including yeasts, molds, fusarium. Some are not good. Fusarium and aspergillus can be problematic. Penicillium, we know, is very positive in terms of using for healing. And then we've got mycorrhizae and endophytes, which actually live inside of plants. And all of these in this fungal world have a role in keeping life in the soil going. Fungi are a primary decaying agent. You can't see it, but on the surface of every leaf and piece of organic matter out in your yard, there is fungi on those surfaces and bacteria. And they're already working. And as soon as that leaf hits the ground, there's a whole new cycle starting to break that down and chew it up and use it up and recycle it through the system. Fungi break down the lignins and cellulose. If they didn't, we would just be probably piled miles high in detritus on this planet. They break down the chitin shells of the insects and bones of animals. So that's why you don't see, you know, boneyards from, you know, around in terms of all the animals that pass away. You think about, you know, you never see dead birds hardly ever, and all the everything else that dies, it immediately gets broken down and passed on and recycled. So mycorrhizae are really, really magical because they have a symbiotic association with plant roots that extend root systems far and wide. So without healthy soils and without fungi in your soils or minimized fungi, your plants are going to be more stressed because they haven't got this relationship with these organisms that actually can really enhance their ability to grow and to be healthy. The fungi can spread out, and through these tubes, they just keep linking on, and they can bring back resources from pretty far away that the plant's roots just don't go that far, but the fungi can. So the fungi tubes transport air, water, and bacteria. And 90 to 95% of plants have a mycorrhizal association and relationship. And it can be with one type of fungi, or it can be with a number of species. So the way mycorrhizae work is that there are ectomycorrhizae, which are on the outside of the root structures and trading on the surface of the roots, or there are the avusculars, which actually penetrate and get into the inside and do their thing and have the relationship with the plant. Now, some of the avuscular fungi can be pests in terms of Fusarium wilt, for instance, is one of those that, you know, if the plant gets this particular fungus, it strangles the circulation system of the plant, and essentially strangles it to death. But this symbiotic relationship with fungi is really something you want to work towards in improving your soils and really encouraging. And you encourage that through the uses of mulches and building your soils, and we'll be talking more in detail. They convert insoluble nutrients into plant available forms, and they exchange those nutrients for the sugars that the plants provide through photosynthesis. And one in particular that's very important to plant life and rooting is phosphorus. Fungi is especially, that's their, you know, what they're seen as their a premier role. And then the waste from these relationships and just their whole, I'm trying to think of the word, but anyway, that provides nitrogen to the soil that then again also can be taken up by plants. So sometimes you can see mycorrhizae in the soil. You see these little fine white hairs. Now, besides roots, mycorrhizae can look like a mat of white, very fine white hairs. But they're very important in accessing and transporting all the major minerals that we know plants need. Earthworms, they're a great indicator of good, healthy soil. If you can go out and turn over a shovel full of dirt and you see earthworms, that's a very good indication that you've got a good balance of microorganisms in the soil, because worms aren't typically there if the rest of the soil food web isn't in good condition, and that your soils aren't too compacted. So healthy soil contains roughly 10 to 50 earthworms per square foot. They're master shredders. They take organic matter down, pull it into the soil, chew it up, and then from there, other organisms, as they poop out the excrement from their job, other organisms are taking it up and doing other things with it as well. So they really help with soil aggregation and water holding capacity. And please, excuse me. So earthworms help increase the microbial population, and they aid plant growth and increase fertility. So other soil organisms really help to decompose, besides earthworms, decompose organic matter. They help sequester nitrogen and other nutrients. Because if there weren't these organisms, and we'll talk about how fertilizer influences soil organisms, when the soil organisms aren't there, what happens is these nutrients get moved out and nothing is there to help trade them with the roots. So it makes things, what may seem, in the presence of soil organisms, you may have very fertile soils, but without them, there's nothing there to actually make them available to plant roots. Some soil organisms fix nitrogen and help make it available to plants. They increase soil aggregation and porosity. A couple of them are actual predators and prey on pests in the soils. There are nematodes, good nematodes that prey on root nematodes that are pests. There is mycorrhizae that also feeds on nematodes. So a lot of these things help keep the pests in the soil in balance so that they don't become a problem. And they're also food for each other and above ground animals, as I mentioned before. So the benefits of the soil food web, and this will kind of wrap this part up, is that it helps, soil fertility really helps nurture healthy plants. And these are from the Soul of Soil. This is a fabulous book if you're really into soils and want to know more about this. But through the activities of soil microbes, the basic raw materials needed by plants are made available at the right time and in the right form and amount. So that's just sort of the magic of what the soil food web can do for your garden and your plants. Microorganisms are little nutrient facilitators. And we'll talk later about humus, but they are responsible for the constant breakdown and decomposition of organic matter and recycling it. So this is so humus is one of these topics that a lot of people talk about, and virtually pretty much I've come to the conclusion based on research that I have recently read is that really humus doesn't exist, and that I think, let's see, I know I've got another slide in here earlier or later, but so essentially what we want to be looking at is compost. Just a way to constantly keep adding organic matter to your soil because it improves the physical health of your soil. Supposedly, the thought was in the past that humus is this, it produces this slime, or that bacteria and fungi produces slime that turns into, and it's kind of a combination of organic matter, composting, and then you get the bacteria and the fungi, and then you wind up with this wonderful stuff that helps bind your minerals together. But again, some of the latest research through the UC system shows that maybe it doesn't really exist because the way they've gone about determining this is all in the lab, and they can't duplicate the results out in the field. So it tells you something's not quite right. So anyway, so again, a healthy food web helps control disease. It's part of a much large, diverse community system. It keeps pathogens in check. A healthy soil food web replaces the need for fertilizers and pesticides, herbicides, and fungicides. And it improves your water and air holding capacity tremendously. So that's why I've talked about this, because building your soil will help you reduce the amount of water that is needed, and it will result in healthier plants. Essentially, bacteria and fungi are the equivalent to fertilizer. And protozoa and nematodes are the fertilizer spreaders. So talking about, I know that this whole thing about organic fertilizers versus chemical fertilizers, and you know, a lot of people, there's a lot of stuff you'll see online, and some people just won't let go of the organic fertilizers, but they result in a decline in the population of bacteria and fungi in the soil. So it really depletes the capability, the ability of the soil food web to do all that work we've just talked about. It reduces plant available nitrogen because it just gets burned, it's ruined the organisms that help do that job. It slows the production of the plant sugars. It slows down the humus formation, which in essence is, you know, we talk about right now, we talk about storing carbon in the soil. That's what that is. And the worms are very irritated by chemical fertilizers. So it's something that when you're using them, you're not going to have as many worms working the soil for you. And they're a one-shot wonder. Your plants will use what they can reach at the time, and from there, water will move them out and away, and then they wind up in the water table or downstream when there's too many of them, but it's very little of it is actually utilized by your plants. So chemical fertilizers deteriorate your soil structure, which then decreases your water holding capacity. Fertilizers are salts, so they build up in the soil. And as all that starts to happen, it provides the opportunity for more pathogens and pests to move in because there's not the population of the soil food web to keep them in control. And fertilizers are one of the #1 polluters of our waterways, our creeks, streams, rivers, water tables, etc. Now, rototilling. This is something that I know a lot of my fellow soil enthusiasts say never, ever, ever rototill. But I say do it once, get your organic matter incorporated, and then never rototill again. Just depends on how much time you have and really kind of the condition of your soils as it is. Rototilling breaks up the whole soil food web. Everything kind of has its level and its preferred spot. And they're working away, and here you come with a rototiller and just turn everything upside down. It breaks up the fungal hyphae, it destroys worms, pulverizes all the arthropods, micro and macro arthropods, and destroys, it can destroy the soil structure when done again and again and again because it's constantly breaking it down. And again, if done too much, it reduces air and water holding capacity. I think done once and to incorporate a lot of organic matter into your soils when you don't have much organic matter in your soils will help increase the air and water holding capacity, because from there you will end up, you'll start just layering on compost and mulches, etc., and let them work into the soil themselves, where the soil food web can take it and break it down and incorporate it in the soil. So rototilling once is good. All the time, don't do it. Not unless you just really want to ruin your soils and compact them and just burn up all the goodness that's there in the soil. So the first priority for building your soil is to restore a diverse soil food web. And you want to build and maintain the organic matter, you want to use compost, and you want to mulch. Again, from the soul of the soil, the proper care and feeding of soil organisms demands close attention to managing soil organisms. So think of yourself as a soil farmer. If that helps you to kind of go, oh, I need to take care of this and treat it with respect and, you know, put good things into it. So no matter what kind of soil you have can have sandy soils, decomposed granite, clay. That's, you know, a lot of people think they have clay and they don't. But again, using the soil web app, etc., or doing the test, you'll find out whether or not you do. But no matter what type of soil you have, it is improved by organic matter. Organic matter will improve your soil structure. It'll improve the nutrient availability and retention in soils, because all those organisms are constantly recycling and holding on to those nutrients. You'll improve the water holding capacity and drainage. You'll minimize pests and diseases. And it has the function of buffering the pH at the root zone. So even though you might have slightly acidic or slightly basic soils, once you have the soil food web working for you, this buffering occurs in the root zone because of soil organisms. So the amendments you want to use for building your soil and maintaining the soil food web include compost, number one, manures, cover crops, mulch, compost tea, worm castings, mycorrhizal fungi, and other, and we'll talk about those other amendments. I'm not recommending them, but people ask about them, people know about them, so I will mention them. So compost is the art and science of mixing organic matter and to help facilitate the decay process into a stable humus or somewhat stable compost. Nothing's really stable. Everything always decays down to the nth degree, and then it gets recycled and uptaken by plant roots, turn into plants, and then starts life over again. Compost is high in microbial life and microarthropods. So by creating compost, you're sort of giving a boost to the soil. You can use it to inoculate your soil, because essentially what you're doing is adding a whole bunch of goodness, like having a health shake in the morning. There's no tainted or toxic materials in your compost as long as you're not adding anything to it. As long as you're not adding herbicides or pesticides or fungicides. And this is a rule of thumb that I have done for 40 years, incorporating roughly 12 cubic yards per 1,000 square feet of compost into your soils. First time you're going to start a landscape project, whether it's a garden bed over here, or if you can, you know, ultimately, and that's what I've just done, just getting the landscaping done on my own home after being here 10 years. And boy, just compost and manures, etc. After that, once you get the compost incorporated into your soils and have everything raked out and you've got your plants all planted, then annually you want to continue to use compost around your plants to constantly, again, let it be incorporated by the soil organisms. They'll do the work for you. You don't have to incorporate it anymore. No more rototilling, no more hoeing. Animal manures are great. They're best actually put into your compost if you can, and just let it all decay together. However, you may want to utilize things like llama or alpaca poo, rabbit poo. Those things can go on fresh and in the garden, and you don't have to worry about composting them. Horse manure, steer manure, you want to compost thoroughly before you utilize it in the garden, and make sure you mixed up really, really well when you do, and then let it sit a little bit before you start planting so that it continues to rot and get assimilated. One of the things you want to be very cautious about with horse manure is if people are using dewormers with their horses, you want to let that thoroughly compost before you put it into your soil. Otherwise, it affects the soil life in the soil. So you don't want to necessarily incorporate any kind of fresh horse manures into your garden if they've got, you don't want to incorporate fresh, but you want to let them compost even longer. So manures help stimulate humification of organic matter, but again, it aged at least 6 months. Now chicken manures too, when I've got chickens and I rake the poo up a couple times a year or every couple months, and I put that into my compost bin, and it just gets composted with everything else. And boy, I'm getting some really nice compost these days, having added, you know, a couple of bucketfuls of chicken manure in there with the rest. Green manures are plant, essentially it's, you plant seeds and let the crop come up and chop and drop it before it goes to seed to help improve the soil. The roots of these plants, of green manures, help loosen the soil. You've got lots of root activity feeding the microorganisms in the soil. So you've got that going on, and then when you chop and drop it, you've got all that organic matter just also laying there waiting for the decomposition to happen, and all the organisms of every like starting to break it down and get involved in the process. So those can really help build your soil as well if you've got poor soils. A lot of people use this green manures now in their raised beds to help build their soils in between crops. Legumes in particular can help add more capability of adding nitrogen to the soils. And using green manures are especially effective for heavy and compacted soils that have little organic matter. So if you've got pastures or heavy soils and you're thinking about trying to improve the tilth of it, getting started with the green manures is a way to go. They've got, if you look on various sites, if you Google green manures, they've got mixes available for spring planting, fall planting. They've got them for irrigated or non-irrigated situations. So there's a lot of variety out there in those mixes. Cover crops are very similar, except you're not chopping and dropping them like you are the green manures. You're planting them alongside, and it helps suppress the growth of weeds. What it does is it adds a lot more variety of root growth to an area, which again then, the more roots, the more enhanced microbial life and soil food web you get. And it attracts and feeds beneficial insects. That's a big plus to using cover crops. It helps bring in the beneficials that then keep pests under control. It helps shade the soil, which then shading the soil helps maintain the water, so your soils don't dry out so fast. And again, I got suppressed weeds in there twice, but hey, anything that helps weeds is great. Mulches. So once you've put your compost down and you've gotten your soils prepared and you've got your plants in, you should mulch. And mulches is a term that refers to any material placed on the soil. It helps reduce evaporation, it prevents weed growth, and it helps insulate the roots. Again, it does help provide a home for beneficial organisms. And those help keep your pests under control. We suggest a maximum of 2 to 3 inches thick, and make sure you taper any mulch away, compost and mulch away from the base of the tree so you don't get crown rot. It's very important to do that. Don't pile it up, and don't just let it be even with the surface. You can see how dried out the dirt on the before picture is versus with a layer of mulch. It just really does keep things a lot more moist. Organic mulches are superior to inorganic mulches in they help keep providing wood chips are fabulous because in particular, they really help grow the mycelium, the fungi really like wood materials. That's what they really take in, and it helps grow that the mycelium and fungal network in your soil. Leaves and pine needles are fine. And now, yes, we're living in a fire-prone state. So one of the things you want to be very careful, depending on where you live, of how thick you let these layers get and where they are. Do not put mulches up to your living structures within 5 feet of the house. That's a good place to use a nice ornamental gravel mix that's say 2 to 3 inches deep. But otherwise, as long as you don't get your mulches too terribly thick, and you know, you're going to have some moisture in the soil, hopefully, that isn't a tremendous fire danger. Grass clippings, you can, you know, if you want to use your grass clippings, especially like in your garden beds, your vegetable garden beds, that's a great one for letting work into the soil. And straw can also be very effective. Not particularly attractive, but it can be effective. So again, in building your soil, add roughly 12 cubic yards per 1,000 square feet. That gives you roughly 4 inches. And rototill that in. And you want to do that in 2 different lifts because you don't want to just pile it all on 4 inches deep and then try to work it in. Put half of it down, rototill in as deep as you can, add the rest, rototill it in, and you will just have given yourself a tremendous boost to getting your soil to be workable and start. Once you start getting your plants in the ground, the roots are supplying those exudates, the sugars, the soil organisms will come, and then you get this nice soil food web working for you. So if you don't want to rototill, sheet mulching can also be very effective, and I would highly urge you to look up Toby Hemingway's bomb-proof sheet mulch. Toby was the author of Gaia's Garden. He was a fabulous permaculture instructor. He's no longer with us, but this was one of his diagrams and layers. And so that's another way to build soil. If you've got some really tough stuff to deal with, putting this down, walking away, within a year's time, Mother Nature will do the work for you in terms of providing better soils underneath that. Compost teas. Now, as master gardeners, we don't talk in detail about compost teas because the problem is you can never make identical batches. Compost teas are compost in general. You can't, you know, no batch is going to be the same from time to time to time. It depends on whatever you're using in your kitchen and whatever you got left in the yard. And some people, I use rice hulls, some people use straw. It just depends on what you're using. So because of that, we don't teach about compost tea, but it's enough to explain that what it is. It's actively aerated compost. You put it in a bag, you aerate it. What it helps do is grow soil organisms, and then you can pour it over your soil and it can give you a boost in starting to build up organisms in the soil that you want. It's not leachate, it's not manure tea, but again, you can Google compost tea and find out more about it if that's something of interest to you. Worm castings are magic. They are water soluble and allow, they're really easy to use. You don't need much of them. Worm castings are worm poop. You can see that they're very granular in nature. They're like little time capsules. It's like putting down a time release fertilizer, but a very low rating of 553 is the equivalent of nitrogen, potassium, phosphorus. And it's much richer in nutrient than bulk compost. So if, you know, it's not inexpensive, but a little goes a very long way. It's something that I've used when I planted my fruit trees this year, and I can't believe how gangbusters everything is gone. So anyway, the fruit and vegetable test, and this is through the UC system, there's a reference at the bottom of the page. Fruit and vegetable tests have resulted in yields using worm castings of 57 to 200% additional production, in addition to improved taste and appearance of fruits. So worm castings are definitely something to consider using in your soil prep. And worm tea, on the other hand, is also one of those things. So taking your worm castings, creating a tea out of it, and applying it either direct application on the plants or using it as a foliar spray can really help boost the microbial activity, but plus give your plants a boost as well. So now we're going to get into water usage. We've talked a lot about soil, but I think hopefully with what I just imparted, you see the importance of having your soil first, getting that built up, so now you can get into the reducing and using water. So plant selections and groupings will greatly influence water use. We'll talk about hydrozoning. We've already talked about compost and mulch, and the next time we'll talk about efficient irrigation components and scheduling. So in terms of reducing water use, one of the numbers right up front, I mentioned this at the beginning, remove and replace your lawns. There's lots of lawn substitutes out there these days that, in my mind, as a landscape architect, as somebody who tries to develop gardens that promote wildlife and birds and pollinators, etc., a lawn you'll get far more bang for your buck if you reduce the lawn or get rid of it. Establishing hydrozones, we'll talk about what that is, using drought-tolerant plants and installing drip lines, irrigation systems. So what is hydrozoning? It's the practice of clustering plants with similar water requirements together to conserve water. So like I mentioned, it's always been the practice, yeah, you think about, oh, I've got plants for sun, or I've got plants for shade or partial shade. But rarely do we think in terms of the water needs. And that hasn't been a practice till fairly recently. So what you really want to do is focus on the water needs as well. Whether you have plants in the ground, like planting in pots, or even veggie beds. This really does help maximize or minimize. It maximizes your efficiency, it minimizes your water use. This is a landscape design, a schematic, based on the water use value of plants. So, and what you want to do is find, in this particular case, all the plants in blue have the same ratings for water use. What you don't want to do is combine high use water plants, rhododendrons, azaleas, etc., with salvias and other plants that are very low water use, because one of them will suffer. You'll either give the plants that are low water use too much water, or the high water use plants far too little, and something will be stressed and not healthy. In here you can see how the groupings are utilized a little more. When you start, this is an example of probably what not to do. This is mixed up where things are intermingled. And so it makes it, what you're going to end up doing is watering for your moderate, in this particular case, you're going to water for your moderate use plants, which means you're overwatering everything that's a low water use. If you logically separate areas into zones and then choose your plants wisely for those zones, you will be able to fine-tune your irrigation system and you will have plants that are compatible with each other and look good and be healthier because they're actually in an area that's meeting your needs. And in this particular case, here's a lawn substitute, the Carex panza meadow. Carex panza is a little miniature sedge that can really be a nice lawn substitute. So I think you can see troubleshooting water use differences. When you've got a mixture of plants with different water needs, it is very, very difficult to be efficient with watering. So in this case, what you start wanting to do is consider moving some plants, removing some, trying to make things a better fit with each other to reduce the amount of water you're using and plus have healthier plants in general when they get that. This is a good example from one of my instructors in the past for irrigation efficiency. She took a picture of her mother's and it's like, so is this water efficient? Well, it looks, again, this is another one of those that is very deceptive. You know, just looking at this picture, you probably don't even really know or wonder, but as soon as you see that you've got this mix of plants, well, the fact that you've got low water plants, at least all around an edge, you can irrigate on one system, and then you've got your moderate to the inside, that allows you to have a separate system and manage water that way. But without kind of breaking things down into zones of like plants, it's very difficult to manage your water. So for existing landscapes, if you've already got, you know, your landscapes are done and you're trying to make them more water efficient. So aside of starting to add compost and mulches to your garden to help improve your soils and the water holding capacity of your soils, you'll want to kind of lay out what you've got and then go through and there's some great apps. You may not even know what your plants are. A lot of times it's people don't know exactly what they've got, but there's some wonderful apps out there right now. I've been using, of course I don't have my thumb, I think it's called Plant This, something this. Anyway, I'll look it up. And you take a picture of it and it will tell you what plant you probably have. It's not right 100% of the time, but at least it's better than nothing. There's a number of pages on Facebook for plant ID. That is really pretty darn foolproof. It's just amazing how many knowledgeable people, if you post to one of the plant ID pages, you'll get somebody who really does know what they're talking about and can give you a correct ID. So once you've determined, you know, if you've got a low use water plant, mid use water plant, high use water plant, then you can start to think about how you're going to manage this. So separate hydrozones would include, if you're going to keep a lawn or even a lawn substitute, that still wants to be dealt with separately. Mass plantings of perennials and ground covers. Vegetable gardens should always be dealt with separately because those are pretty high water use, but good use, that's a good trade-off. And then sun versus shade plants, those should be irrigated separately and treated separately. And then flat versus slopes. You do not want to be irrigating those together because you'll end up having, if you're irrigating enough for a slope, you won't have enough on the flat. If you're irrigating properly for the flat, you'll end up with water running down your slopes. So anyway, all those factors come into hydrozoning and separating and thinking about how you apply water. There's, on this page down at the bottom, if you're not sure of a plant's watering needs, there's a great resource out there called WUCOLS. Water use classification of landscape species. It's so simple. You just put in your city, the plant name, and it'll tell you what that plant's water needs are. Or if in particular you want to find something that fits a certain category, you can do the same thing with this particular app. So WooCalls is another great app and resource available to help you work through sorting out your landscape and getting things hydrozone. In this particular case, we had looked up Nandina. And what's really interesting to me is that regular old Nandina domestica, heavenly bamboo, is a low water use plant, as opposed to the dwarf variety, which is considered a moderate to medium. Now, these plant classifications have been put together by hundreds of landscape professionals coming together and working this out based on experience over, I don't even know what the cumulative years are, but it's a lot of years of people's experience with plant materials. So even I found this surprising, but so there you go. You might find some surprises of your own. So it's actually maintained by UC Division of Agriculture and Natural Resources. And again, it's developed by landscape professionals, but it is friendly enough for the landscape gardener. Whoops, please tell me no. Are we still there? I hope. Okay, so it provides information on the water needs for more than 3,500 plants. It gives you plant factors. We'll be talking a little more about this later, about how you can develop water budgets, which gets a little more complicated. We're not going to go into a great deal. Once you have these resources, and depending how determined you are, at least you'll know where to go to be able to do this. So what happens when plants, so we all know plants photosynthesize, and we know plants take up water, so what happens to it from there? Well, it transpires, and the water around the soil evaporates. So we call this evapotranspiration. And this is taken into account when you develop water schedules, because we all know that, especially these hot days that we're having right now in the summer, right now July is the highest evapotranspiration month out of the year, because our days are long and hot, as opposed to as we start coming down in August, evapotranspiration rates start going down, and you start reducing the amount of time you're irrigating and the amount. So that helps you become a little more efficient with your water use as well. Things that affect evapotranspiration are solar radiation. How intense is the sun? If it's not a cloudy day, you're getting, maximum. Air temperature affects it. The relative humidity, which we don't seem to have much of that in California, at least not the part I live in. Wind, the windier it is, the more the evapotranspiration is occurring. It dries the soil and the plants out much quicker. The soil exposure, if you don't have mulches down, your soil is going to be losing a lot more water to the environment. And then your planting densities. Plants sitting just here, there, if they're closer in together, not packed tight, but just, it creates its own little environment that is a little less severe. So let's talk about lawns and why you shouldn't have them, or I shouldn't say. Anyway, so lawns by acreage are the nation's largest irrigated crop, surpassing corn. Now that's all fine and dandy if you live in places like Illinois and Midwest and back east, when you got plenty and plenty of rain, etc., and you don't have the kind of summers we've got with absolutely no rain between, the end of April till the end of October. They're a vestige of Old English gardening. It is something the lawn care and horticulture industries have persisted in pushing. that we must have lawns. You still see model homes. No, not so much anymore. The newer model homes are showing absolutely no lawns or these tiny little postage stamps. So they are getting better about that. Some cities like LA provide lawn rebate programs, and Sacramento was doing it for a while too. I don't know whether it still is. I believe Roseville, city of Roseville was doing it. Many of the larger cities do provide or were providing rebates. Whether they're still doing it or not, I don't know. A good, for instance, in Las Vegas, 9.2 billion gallons of water have been saved through turf removal. I'm still dismayed when I go down, not this year, but the year before, go down for the native plant tours and still see so much lawn in the Sacramento region. And yet here we are on, going to alternate watering days, etc. And that's quite a waste of water. The other aspect about lawns is they're a monocrop, they're ecological deserts. They don't support pollinators or wildlife. They generally require fertilizers and pesticides, which contaminate groundwater and pollute. And it's like, I had somebody ask me the question of, oh, well, I've got to spray for poison, for black widows. And it's like, I've got children. It's like, well, if you've got children, why would you want to put toxics on your yard where they're running around? I think that you've got to think about the trade-offs, and including, I mean, they're finding that pets are getting cancer far more and more, and a lot of it they're tying to the use of pesticides and herbicides on lawns, because that's what most people have. And then lawns are far more costly and result in more air pollution because of all the equipment required to maintain that crop. I think something got out of order. So we are done for this evening. I've got a few resources for soils. Whoops, that one got in there. That should have been out of there. But if we can come back and let's see, from here, I will take, I can answer questions. And I am not seeing, let's see. Mary, are you still there?
If folks have questions, this is a great time to put them in the chat. And
Yes, I'm still here.
Whoop. I am going to go back. Let's see, let's go. Yeah. So if we do have, I'd be happy to answer questions. Next week, we will talk far more about, like I mentioned before, the irrigation and capturing and utilizing rainwater. So that'll be hitting the nitty-gritty with the water application. So do we have any questions? Are they showing up anywhere, Mary or Tracy?
Yeah, so there's a couple things. There's some folks that are saying thank you so much. They really appreciate the presentation. Next, I posted a link to where this presentation will be posted, not until tomorrow afternoon, but if folks want to just click that link, you can cut and paste it and look at that again tomorrow. And then Elizabeth wants to know about gardening methods that can save water, such as core gardening.
Core gardening?
C-O-R-E, core gardening.
Is that an acronym?
You know, I'm not sure.
I've not heard that term before.
Elizabeth, if you'll give us a little more information in the chat, we'll come back to that. Chris asks, I'm looking for a lawn substitute for a mostly shady area. Any suggestions?
Carex, the Carex panza would be a great plant to look at. Really love the way it's a bunch. not a bunch grass, but it's a bunch. It's not a true grass, but it's got nice little seed heads that the birds like. I think that in the next class, I'll be talking more specifics and specifically about lawn substitutes. So that'll be a question, something to cue in there, or at least if you can't attend, come back and you'll find the presentation later.
Perfect. Next question, how do you get to the soil website?
The soil web app, is that it? The soil web app, just go to whoever your provider is, the app store with Apple, and just search for soil web, and you will come up with the app. I hope that's what you were asking. And then load that, and you put in, you just tell it, I want the soils for my location, and it will zoom right in and tell you exactly what you've got.
Great. Let's see, I've got lots more comments here. Is there, you can tell if there is asbestos in your soil?
I happen to live in an area that is, I am literally, a corner of my property falls in the asbestos zone in our county. And so where you live has asbestos maps, the county does. And you should be able to find out that information. Matter of fact, the soil web app should be able to tell you whether you have asbestos. Yes. And so if you have friable asbestos on your property, you want to keep it wet while you're working it to get it that one-time rototill or sheet mulch it. And then you to put a mulch on top of that to keep it from being friable and getting kicked up in the air. Yeah, that's something, if I lived in one of those areas, I know that we're very careful not to get a reason.
So the next question is about green manures. With green manures, are you cutting and working them into the soils? Can you explain a little more about what you do with the green manures once they grow?
So with green manures, you are simply chop and dropping. You are not working it back into the soil. You are leaving it. You don't want to disturb that because the organisms are still down there interacting with the roots. Now, some of them may grow back or they'll just die out for the season. Some clovers will grow back, and it partially depends on whether you're irrigating or not. Or they'll just go ahead and go dormant, and you will have to reseed for next year. So it depends on what mix you're using, but it is literally, it's a chop and drop. It's leave it lay, don't work it into the soil. Matter of fact, throw mulch after you've done that if you want to throw mulch, or just actually let what you've chopped and dropped be the mulch cover until it goes away, and then be reseeding for the following year.
So Alice asks, with chop and drop, do I end up, sorry, I'm gonna start again. With chop and drop, I do end up with trouble earwigs, especially destructive when the plants are young. Any ideas on how to address earwigs?
Yeah, so I would suggest you go to the type in earwigs UCIPM, and you will come up with the pest notes for earwigs. There's ways to trap them, and I know that wet rolled up newspaper, and then you go out in the morning and collect that and throw it away. The earwigs will have gotten inside. Yes, you know, there's trade-offs to some of these practices in that earwigs love wet, moist, tidy places. So, you know, trapping them. And then the other thing is to put out dishes with a layer of oil in it. A friend of ours, what they do is, because I know, and I would have the same issue, my dogs would be licking up the oil. So they put a cap on it and just cut a little hole into the side, say a margarine tub or something like that. Who uses margarine? So anything, you know what I mean. So anyway, cut holes in the side of that. Earwigs will crawl in, and as soon as they get in the oil, they're trapped. They can't get out. So there's ways to trap them and reduce the populations.
And I put the link to the earwig IPM pest note into the chat if anyone's interested in that.
Great.
So here's a good question. Wondering, are all lawns bad? I have St. Augustine and it takes little water and 0 fertilizer.
Well, that's good. That's a good start. I mean, bad is, you know, is subjective, and so it's still an ecological desert compared to a meadow that would have more variety and diversity in it. So it partially, you know, is it 95% of your yard or is it 15% of your yard? You know, so kind of those value judgments. It's the whole, and good for you for choosing a lawn that already cuts down and reduces the use of chemicals and water. But so that's a better choice than many others.
Okay, here's a good question. What type of plants are good for shady mornings but burning afternoons?
Shady mornings and burning afternoons. Oh,
Correct.
yeah. I would highly suggest you go to the okay, so I'm a California plant native nut in terms of plants that give you the greatest biodiversity bang for your buck. So I'd highly suggest you go take a look at the CalFlora site, calflora.org, and then they have, and I can't look at it right now, I believe it's called Plant This, or what grows here. Yeah, what grows here. Because then you can look at your specific location and you tell it, I want something that can take late day sun, hot west sun, something like that. And it will come up with a whole list of plants, and you can narrow it down by, you know, large shrub, ground cover, medium shrub, tree, etc. So I would use that as a resource because there's just tons of choices. Yeah, I mean, I could just write, you know, I can look at my plant list for my house and tell you what's really doing well, but I don't know where you are, and plus your tastes and other things you have growing around you. It'd be hard to just focus on one.
Okay, great. Thank you. I'm going to give one more question and then we'll end this meeting for tonight. We'll try to get to these couple other questions via email. But Ramona wants to know, what are your feelings on weed cloth? I
use it under my pathways, and that's the only place I use it, because it prevents organic matter from interfacing and interacting with your soil. It really interferes with the whole process, and it definitely inhibits the whole thing with the soil food web and the organisms there. They're reliant on what's coming down and getting incorporated. So you put down the weed fabric and you're really, you know, like putting a hat on that. I mean, it's just, you're not going to have the interactions that you are looking to have, in my mind.
Great. And I think UC research would back you up on that, Kit. Excellent, excellent class today. We've kept you until 8:15, so what I'd like to do is adjourn the class. If you can help me by using your reaction and giving Kit a round of applause. Thank you so much for joining us this week. We hope to see you next week, same time, same Zoom link. You can find more about Master Gardeners at ucanr.edu. You can also find us on Facebook, and you can visit us at our Sherwood Demonstration Garden in Placerville, 6699 Campus Drive. It's behind the community college. And so what we'll do is we'll adjourn this meeting. Anyone who wants to stay on, Elizabeth had a couple more questions.
Okay.
If that's all right with you, Kit?
Fine.
But the rest of us, I don't want to keep you any longer, so I just want to say thank you for joining us. Have a great rest of your week, and thank you for being here with us.
Thank you. So
I'm still here.